Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking with Paul Singer, Washington correspondent at USA Today, about congressional reporting.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. Our mission includes journalists around the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, president of the National Press Foundation. With me today is Paul Singer, Washington correspondent at USA Today. Paul has covered Congress off and on for 25 years. He also teaches a journalism class at Georgetown University called Covering Capitol Hill. Thank you for joining us, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Sandy. Appreciate it.
So first we're going to talk about how Congress used to work.
Indeed. Back in the day. This is part of what I teach as well, that Congress has changed some. And it's actually now newsworthy because the Republicans in Congress are arguing for a return to what they call regular order, the prior process. It used to be that when you had a bill that you wanted to introduce, it would go to the subcommittee, and the subcommittee would mark up the bill, that is, make changes to the bill, and then it would go to a full committee, and the full committee would take that up, and they would mark it up and vote it out, and then it would go to the leadership to decide, when to give it floor time. And then in theory, it would get to the floor and the House of Representatives would vote on it, and then it would go to the Senate, and they do the whole thing all over again, the subcommittee and the committee markups. Most of that has been eliminated. And the frustration that I think we've seen now that ended up costing Speaker John Boehner his job was from the sort of backbench members of Congress who believe that process is so obliterated that there's nowhere for them to go to get a vote on the measures that they care about. They can't offer an amendment. There is no subcommittee markup that matters. What happens now is, if there's an important piece of legislation, the leadership in the House and the leadership in the Senate meet with the White House and they sit in a small room and they hammer out a bill, and then they introduce it on a Wednesday, and on a Friday it's being voted, and that's done. And you've lost what they call regular order, which is this process of moving a bill through subcommittee, through committee, and giving members of Congress a chance to vote on it. It was a great opportunity for us as reporters because there was all these places where you could write a story about, they added this in subcommittee. They added this in full committee. Now nobody cares.
Mm-hmm. Now the new Speaker, Paul Ryan, says he's bringing back the power of the committees.
That's right.
So who will be where will the power centers reside now, and how long will that take to occur? Do you think that's going to happen next week?
It's a very interesting question how he's going to pull this off. I mean, the reason that the committee chairmen have lost power over the years is because the parties and the leadership of the parties want to be able to manage the agenda and control the agenda. And you want to avoid putting your own members on the spot for a difficult vote they don't want to have to take. Particularly for a bill that's not going to pass anyway. Why bother? So when you have the committee chairman empowered, they can move whatever piece of legislation they want to. I mean, maybe a committee chairman wants to reinstate the draft, and suddenly you're going to get members of Congress having to vote on whether or not we should reinstate the draft. And what member of Congress wants to do that? When the Senate's not going to take this bill up, why should we bother? We're just creating an opportunity for basically public embarrassment. On the other hand, if you have members of Congress who believe that reinstating the draft is an important thing, Charlie Rangel every year, then you need an outlet for them to get a chance to express that view. Their constituents supposedly care about it. That's why they're bringing the bill up. That kind of thing is going to be the tension between the committee chairs who want to express their power and the speaker, the new speaker, who wants to have some control over the agenda. I mean, I think where you really see this example is in the Export-Import Bank, a topic none of us thought we would care about, but it's become a real lightning rod for the most conservative wing of the Republican Party. They did not want to renew this bill. They did not want to renew the charter of the Export-Import Bank, and so the committee chairman just sat on it and said, we're not going to move it. Well, the Senate wants it moved. Other people in the House, in fact, the majority of the House wants it moved. So this week they put together a coalition of people, Democrats and Republicans, and shoved it to the House floor to get the bill moved because they couldn't get it out of committee. that's going to be a really interesting challenge for the new speaker to manage those personalities.
So let's say that there will be changes in the House. Let's just give Paul Ryan the
I
benefit of the
have
doubt.
to assume there will.
Right.
Yes.
So what about the other chamber, the Senate? What changes do you expect there?
Well, they're having conversations about the possibility of changing again. You'll hear a lot of what is described as the nuclear option, which is, the Senate's primary power for the minority is they can just say no. They can say no, and it takes 60 votes to overcome that no. There have been arguments made that maybe there are cases where it shouldn't be 60 votes and we should go down to a simple majority. That is an extraordinarily sensitive subject for both parties, because anybody who's recently been in the minority knows that they cling to that filibuster right because it's all they've got. And in fact, we joked around that the last time we had this argument about the so-called nuclear option, I think it was Harry Reid was in the majority and Mitch McConnell was in the minority, and we argued that they could basically just take their talking points and switch podiums, because when it was the other way around, the Republicans were the majority, the Democrats were the minority, they were making the exact same arguments that Mitch McConnell was now making, why we should stop. It is plausible there will be some changes to require less than a 60-vote majority in some cases in the Senate, but I really don't anticipate a fundamental overhaul of that because it's so precious to the minority.
You recommend a book called Congress from the Inside by Sherrod Brown for people wanting to know a little bit more about how the congressional process works. Why do you recommend that? And who is this Sherrod Brown?
Sherrod Brown's a congressman from Ohio, a very progressive congressman from Ohio who was ultimately elected to the U.S. Senate and is now a senator from Ohio. Again, he's really a leader in the progressive movement. I recommend that book. I tell my students that it's not a very good book, so let's start on the premise, but it is a great window inside the mind of a lawmaker. When you read Sherrod Brown's book, and this was written in the mid-1990s, what was going on in the country was Monica Lewinsky and the impeachment scandal, but it shows up nowhere in his book, or a tiny little slice of page 200. Because Sherrod Brown is writing about, our battles over NAFTA and our fight to get some amendment attached on the floor, and we held 1-minute speeches that people on C-SPAN were watching to really generate energy. This is the way members of Congress view the world. It's through this tunnel that is Congressman Singer, and everything Congressman Singer does is important, and everything that is not related to Congressman Singer doesn't really matter. And this book is a great view of that, because you can't read the book without thinking, who is this guy? Why do I care about his amendment that he's so proud succeeded in committee and then lost on the floor, But that's what they day-to-day think about. And if you're going to be covering a member of Congress, you need to be aware that that's what they're thinking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There was a recent Politico article. The headline was, "Welcome to CR Hell." What is a CR, and how did it come to dominate congressional budget making?
So go back to the chart we were talking about and how bills were supposed to progress. Every year, Congress has to appropriate money for the federal government. And there are 12, used to be 13, but now there's 12, I believe, appropriations bills. Each one funds a chunk of the government. So there's one that funds Justice Department and the Commerce Department and the State Department. And there's one that funds the Labor Department. What's supposed to happen is the committees are supposed to mark up these bills and come up with a budget, a spending plan for these bills for their agencies, and that goes to the floor, and then they vote on the bill, and then the Senate does the same thing, and then they have a conference committee, and they pass a bill that appropriates all the money for the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance. And they get it all done by September 30th, which is when the fiscal year expires. They haven't done that for the majority or all of the spending bills for I think we said it was 18 years. I'm not sure that's actually correct, but it was somewhere in the range of 15 to 18 years since they've actually passed all these appropriations bills on time. Instead, what happens is they get to the end and the budget's going to expire, and now it's midnight and we need an extra week to figure out what we're going to do. So they pass what's called a continuing resolution, a CR, And the continuing resolution says, okay, well, for one more week, you can continue to spend your federal budget money at the same rate that you were spending it up until now. And then they get to the end of that week, and lo and behold, they still don't have an answer, and so they go to another, and they do a 3-week continuing resolution. And this continues until usually around Christmas, when they finally decide, okay, now we're going to fund the government. And they do one of two things. Either they take all the bills that have been floating around and mash them into what's called an omnibus and pass it all at once, or they just give up and they say, we're just going to continue last year's funding, a continuing resolution of last year's funding for the rest of the fiscal year. See you again next September. It is not a good way to run the government, because at no point, if you're doing a CR, at no point are you fixing anything that was wrong in last year's budget. Mm-hmm. And particularly if last year's budget was simply an extension of the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that. It's been 4 or 5 years since you've passed an actual appropriations bill for the Department of Interior, and the funding bill still says you'll spend money on, I don't know, flip phones. Well, we don't make flip phones anymore. Someone needs to fix that. That is the problem with the CR process, is that you never get into actually legislating how the government should be spending its money.
Mm-hmm. And how does that affect the agencies?
Well, the agencies all never know whether their budget is going to be the real budget they've proposed, the priorities they've proposed, last year's budget, which may or may not have been actually adjusted for any substantive purpose, or for that matter, whether it's going to be passed on time. I mean, they have to begin every year spending money as if they don't have any, because they're not entirely sure when they're going to get a budget bill, mm-hmm. and they're not sure what the budget bill is going to say.
So last week, Congress reached a 2-year budget deal. What's the significance of that?
The significance of the 2-year budget deal is that it resolves one of the major problems that has prevented us from passing appropriations bills. The reason we haven't been able to pass appropriations bills is we don't have the number, that is the overall number of how much the government's going to spend. If you can't agree on what that overall number is, then you can't send your committees out to say, okay, well, you get 10% of that number, and you get 20% of that number, and you get 15% of that number. Go spend amongst your agencies. We needed to have a top line number so we could then divide that up. Technically with the 302As and the 302Bs, they call them. But basically, those are the numbers that say, all right, well, next year we're going to spend $1.4 trillion. And subcommittee, Committee on Defense, you get this chunk. Committee on Social Security, whatever else, you get this chunk. What the budget deal does is it created those top line numbers for the next 2 years. So now we're not arguing. We're not arguing whether we're going to be under last year's number. We're not arguing about where the number is going to be. We've set that, the top line. Now all we need to do is sort out, who gets which chunk of that. Some of that is in the budget deal as well. The Defense Department will get whatever billions it is. The other domestic spending gets half of it. Fine. Now we can begin to go through the process of writing spending bills that meet those targets. Now, that doesn't satisfy all the problems. It doesn't solve everything. All it does is give us one less thing to argue over.
And essentially it punts it past the election, so it'll
Yes.
be into the next administration.
Right. Well, they also did that for the more significant portion of that was they added a debt ceiling increase, actually a suspension of the debt ceiling. So we were about to run into the point at which the U.S. government can no longer borrow money. And if they can no longer borrow money, that means they can no longer take loans out to pay last year's debts. That was going to be a disaster. Mm-hmm. So instead of fighting over, again, a 2-week extension, 3-week extension, whatever else, they said, to heck with it. We will suspend this whole debt ceiling thing until March of 2017. March of 2017 is a significant date because it is approximately as far from a national election as you can get with officers, with members of Congress and a president in place and in office.
Mm-hmm. You encourage your students to read the bill and cover the markup. What's a markup?
Well, when there were markups, back in the day, the markup is quite literally, if I take a bill to my subcommittee, and the bill says, Section A will do this, Section B will do this, and Section C will do this, and it's a piece of legislation. If you ever read a bill, they're complicated text, but they say the Secretary of the Interior shall, and then Section A, prohibit the hunting of certain fish and wildlife on parklands. A markup is when I bring that bill to the committee to pass, and you come in and you say, I'd like to add a section D, which would be, by the way, there will be no handguns allowed in these wilderness areas. And then we vote, the committee votes on your proposal on handguns, and if we accept it, we've just marked up the bill, we've just added the Sandy Johnson gun provision is now part of the bill. So as the bill goes forward, it has that change in it. Mm-hmm. Very important things can happen in those markups, because that is where language changes, where a gun provision suddenly appears, where a bill that said the Secretary shall do the following things, that might be amended to be the Secretary may do the following things, which, if this is your interest area or your professional business area, the difference between shall and may is huge. People spend millions of dollars to get shalls changed to may, because if the Secretary now has discretion to not do it, that's huge for those people who don't want it done.
Now, markups often happen at inconvenient times for
Yes.
people, late into the night, early morning hours. So, is the drop-off in reporters covering it, is that commensurate with as the clock starts ticking?
It's not so much the drop-off in reporters covering it because of the time. There's been some drop-off in reporters covering this stuff because nobody cares anymore. These bills don't go anywhere. Now, I'm sure your viewers understand, and it's sort of a sophisticated audience here. There are different types of reporters. So I work for USA Today. We're a broad national interest newspaper. We almost never go to a markup because we don't care about these details of policy. Our readers don't care about these details of policy. But we've been putting significant coverage time into cybersecurity legislation, because that's a bill we think that our readers care about, and it's an important topic, and we get a lot of interest in that. But even then, we're not going to go down to the low-level subcommittee markups. But there are trade publications that cover nothing but cybersecurity for a very interested, highly technical audience that pays a lot of money for that information. Those reporters are going to every markup. They're covering every amendment. The Sandy Johnson amendment is going to matter a lot to them. You will still find coverage and reporters giving coverage, but it's a different type of coverage, and it's a different type of news outlet. The sort of daily newspaper with the Washington Bureau doesn't do much of this stuff anymore.
And what is the reward for reporters who actually read the bills?
Well, the best reward is when you find something in there that is not supposed to be in there, or is a bit of a surprise that it's in there. One of my favorites was a guy named Bruce Braley. Congressman Braley had introduced a piece of legislation saying that we were going to buy American. And he went to the floor and he said, Congress needs to buy American-made products. Because if we're going to say that everyone else should buy American, so should the U.S. Congress. Whenever the U.S. Congress buys something, it should be American-made. And I heard that speech, I thought, that's really weird. Congress doesn't buy anything. I mean, what does Congress produce, right? I mean, they don't make stuff. They make basically paper and speeches. They probably buy a bunch of computers. So I went and I looked at the bill. And you read through the bill and it says, blah, 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 this language, that language, as spelled out in the Berry Amendment. I'm like, what's the Berry Amendment? Well, the Berry Amendment was a 1950s amendment that said the Defense Department will buy American-made goods when they are buying canvas tents and hand tools. So this entire bill only applied to when the U.S. Congress bought canvas tents and hand tools, which of course they don't buy. So I wrote a story saying this bill doesn't do anything. It's nonsense. And they, I called their office and said, what is the deal here? And they said, well, it's really trying to get the theme, and we believe it's an important thing to do. And you read the bill, you figure out that it doesn't actually do what they say it does. And it is not all that uncommon to find exactly that the bill doesn't really operate the way they say it operates.
Let's talk about lobbyists. What is their role in writing and influencing legislation?
Well, in theory, lobbying is protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution, right? The First Amendment says that the government shall make no laws prohibiting the citizenry from petitioning their government for redress of grievances. That is lobbying. You work in the timber industry. You want to be able to tell Congress that you need the right to cut trees in these areas. That's what a lobbyist is supposed to do, right? He's supposed to go talk to Congress about, oh, if you are working on legislation regarding forestry, some things you should know. These types of trees we do not cut down because they make lousy paper. These types of trees make good paper, and so we cut them down. So Congress then, when they're considering their law or writing their law, they'll be able to think, well, we can definitely protect this type of tree because the paper industry doesn't want it. This type of tree may have important economic value. We should think more about that. That's what lobbying is supposed to be, right? Providing the expert information for Congress as it's making decisions. Needless to say, I've just given you the school book version of what lobbying is supposed to be. The problem with lobbying, like everything else, is that it is far more than that. For starters, lobbyists are a primary source of campaign contributions for members of Congress. There is also a question when lobbyists begin actually getting involved in volunteering for the member's campaign. Does that suggest that the interests for whom the person is lobbying suddenly has more influence with the member of Congress than they're supposed to? We have seen times when the lobbyists have actually drafted the bill. And if you look at the properties on a document, on an electronic version of a document, you will see that it actually came off of a computer from a lobbying institution before the member of Congress introduced it. Well, look, Congressman Jones, we very much want you to consult with the timber industry before you offer your bill on woodland forestry. But we don't want the timber industry writing the bill for you. That seems excessive. That's where you get into some really interesting issues about lobbyists have an important role to play. And many of us might be members of groups like the National Cancer Society or the Defend the Children group or the National Hunger or Homeless, pick your issue. You have a lobbyist. And that lobbyist goes to Congress and says, hey, homeless issues, they have to be important, and these are the bills you should be passing. That's their job.
And what are some resources for reporters to use to track lobbying influence?
Well, fortunately, it's all publicly disclosed now. And so you can go to, there's a lobbying database that the U.S. House maintains, and the U.S. Senate. They two different databases, of course, and they don't quite line up, but nevertheless. And you can just go find the Lobbying Disclosure Act databases. We also frequently will go to places like Open Secrets, which is a nonprofit organization that is tracking this stuff and compiling it all in one place. I trust their work. I don't usually use their work because I like to do my own reporting afterwards. So I'll see things that that's interesting that Open Secrets sees that. Let me go back and check the database and make sure I agree with them. So that's available, and it's all publicly available. But it does take some practice. These are complicated forms. Sometimes they don't say what you think they say. It takes a while. But you can search an individual lobbyist and figure out where they have been doing their work. And then, of course, you can go into the Federal Election Commission database and figure out what they've been donating to, what their companies have been donating to, what members of Congress have gotten support from those industries. And you can ask the question, which is a fair question. The money I received in campaign donations, was that connected at all to the work I did on the topic area that was to the benefit of those people who were giving me money? That's a fair conversation to have.
And lobbyists, can they be good sources of information for reporters?
Oh, yeah.
Individual lobbyists?
Oh, yeah. Because a lobbyist's job is to tell a story. They're telling a story to a member of Congress. They're telling a story to their members. They're telling a story to the American public about this is why you shouldn't harvest these trees and you should harvest these trees instead, or this is why you should be protecting homeless people. The lobbyist's job is to tell that story. And so they're frequently great sources. They may not go on the record, but they obviously know more about the process and how the process is going to work than you do. They've paid more attention to the bill than you have. They know which of these amendments in the markup are going to be of a particular concern. they're great sources for reporters.
And the Hill is a massive institution. What are your tips on how to create a beat on Capitol Hill?
Well, when I teach my Covering Capitol Hill class, the first thing I do is I pick up 15 or 20 publications and I hand them out to my students, and I assign them a beat that day, the first day of class, and pretty much randomly. And the Congress is a big building with a lot of people, and it covers everything. Its jurisdiction is basically everything. As a reporter, you can't just wander in and say, I'll cover that and two of those. You have to have an idea of who your readership is. Covering Congress for whom? That is the critical question. Who are you covering Congress for? If you're writing for the Baton Rouge Advocate, it's going to be a very different audience than if you're writing for the Rocky Mountain News or Truckers Weekly or Variety or Billboard Magazine, right? I mean, all of those news outlets care about Congress, but they care about very different things. So the Baton Rouge Advocate, I'm sure, is still doing stuff on hurricane relief and hurricane recovery and Katrina money and all this stuff, and they're probably doing a lot on wetlands redevelopment, things that the Rocky Mountain News is not going to be writing, or a newspaper in Utah is not going to care about wetlands restoration. They don't have wetlands like that. So you need to know as a reporter, who is my audience? What issues do they care about? I mean, I assign someone every year to a newspaper called Indian Country Today, which is a newspaper that is written by, for, and about Native American tribes, because they have very distinct issues in front of Congress. And again, they may not care as much about the highway bill, but they care an awful lot about gambling legislation because a lot of these tribes have casinos. They care an awful lot about land rights in the West because a lot of that land they're talking about is swapping for tribal lands. You have to know your audience and know what they want to read about, and then you can look at Congress in the sort of, this is my focus, and I don't care about the other things.
We talked a little bit about how to track lobbying donations. What other forms of following the money are there that you found useful as a reporter?
The U.S. Congress as an institution spends, I don't remember the exact number, but it's several $100 million a year on its own functions. That is, buying paper and computers, hiring 15,000 staff members in the House and Senate, maintaining the Capitol Dome. All of that is federal taxpayer money. Each member of Congress, each member of the House of Representatives gets about $2 million a year to run their office like a small business. They hire their own staff. They make their own decisions about which bottled water they're going to order. They subscribe to newspapers and they subscribe to Congressional Quarterly and other data things. They hire a web consultant to help them design their website and contact their constituents. All that comes out of a taxpayer-funded budget. And it's all publicly reported, more or less. And once every 3 months, the House of Representatives publishes a 3-volume set of all the expenditures of all the members of Congress. And that is now online. And you can just sort of scan through it and look for stuff.
And where is that? What is the website? Do you recall what it's called?
No, but if you just Google disbursements of the House, you'll get to the website. It is the disbursements of the House of Representatives. In the Senate, they do a similar thing, but of course, the House and the Senate, I love these people. The House does it every quarter. The Senate does it twice a year on a fiscal year calendar. So theirs is like September to April and May to October or something. It's some ridiculousness like that. But again, you can go and you can just read through, what did my member of Congress spend on X, Y, or Z, and you find some tremendous stories in there.
And what's an example of a good story that came out of those reports?
Well, my current favorite is the Aaron Schock story. Aaron Schock was the congressman from Illinois, very much on a fast track in the Republican Party, a good-looking young man, very personable, very energetic, traveled the country raising a lot of money for Republican candidates. And someone from the Washington Post went and visited his office and discovered that there was this suite that had been painted to look like Downton Abbey. which was just kind of bizarre, this lavish red rooms with gold frames. And while he was there, the reporter, Ben Terrace, the Washington Post, ran into this woman who said, "Oh, yeah, well, I'm the interior decorator here." And he said, "Wow, that's pretty cool." She said, "Well, I did it all for free." and me and my other pals who do ethics work thought, "Well, you can't do that. You can't give a gift to a member of Congress. That seems excessive. I wonder what that cost." So I went back into the spending books to see what that cost. Well, the spending books are delayed, and this was a recent renovation, so the numbers weren't there. But what we found was that in the past 3 years, Schock had spent like $100,000 on office renovations in his district offices. And we were finding things like $10,000 for hardwood floors. You know, there's one line, Pekin hardwood flooring, whatever. Like, hardwood floors in a congressional office? And then there was something, you know, old world granite and tile. He was getting marble countertops in a congressional office, and you were paying for it. That started this snowball downhill for Aaron Schock. Politico discovered that he was getting reimbursed for mileage, again, out of the same expenditure reports, mileage he couldn't possibly have traveled. I figured out that he was using the same office account to pay for charter flights that he was not allowed to take. He started being investigated by every ethics committee possible. He finally quit the Congress, and now the Justice Department is trying to figure out whether to accuse him of some crime.
So check the disbursement accounts.
Great
idea.
Follow the money, every dollar of the money.
And what about personal financial disclosures?
Personal financial disclosures are really interesting, complicated for a whole number of reasons, but every year, every member of Congress, and for that matter, every senior appointee in the executive branch has to publish a financial disclosure that explains what they own, what they sold and made profit off of, and what income they are getting from various places. Now, they're allowed to receive income if it's, say, stock income. They're allowed to receive income from book deals, assuming they've cleared that through the Ethics Committee first. But they're not really allowed to be involved in a traditional business. You can't still be a used car salesman and a member of Congress at the same time. But sometimes they have some earnings from family corporations and from land, and a lot of them have rental properties. So again, you can look in the personal financial disclosure and say, well, that's interesting. They are making $1 million rental income from this property. And of course the address is there, so you can go look it up and say, that's odd, it looks like a shack. Who's paying them $1 million for this shack? You know, and you find some odd things.
And what's an example of a good story that you've gotten out of the personal financial disclosures?
Well, my favorite was when Charlie Rangel was being investigated for messing up his personal financial disclosures and failing to disclose some ownership interests. The Ethics Committee was investigating him, and the head of the Ethics Committee was a Congressman, Mike McCall, from Texas, and we figured out that Mike McCall had done some of the same things that Charlie Rangel had done. Now, in McCall's case, in all fairness to Mike McCall, he had made an error that his accountant had suggested he make in not declaring these things that his wife owned. And they cleared that up, and you know he was not guilty of the same kind of things that Charlie was guilty of, but it was pretty funny because there was this great moment where the guy who was investigating Congressman Rangel had his own financial disclosure problems.
Overseas travel often seems to land lawmakers in hot water.
Yes.
What's a CODEL, and how do you track the spending for those?
There are two different types of travel that are most interesting. There is the official congressional delegation is paid for by the U.S. Congress. And this is where you and I are the chairman and the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on, I don't know, Cuba, right? And you and I decided it'd be worthwhile to take ourselves and a few other members of Congress to Cuba to go look around. And so we call the Defense Department and say, we'd like to fly to Cuba. And the Defense Department hooks all that up. State Department makes it all happen. And it all gets paid for out of a secret account that nobody ever has to pay for. It's magic money. But it all gets reported in the congressional record that you and I and a couple other members went to Cuba, and here's what we spent, here's what the costs were, here's how long we were there. That's worthwhile travel. You see a lot of stuff in there. Where you see more interesting and more suspicious stuff is the privately funded travel. So let's say some human rights group that does work in Cuba wants you and I to go and take a look around. And they are a nonprofit. They pay for you and I to fly down there. We disclose to the Ethics Committee who is paying for the trip, why they're paying for the trip, what the agenda is. The Ethics Committee looks it over and says, okay, that's permissible. These folks are not precluded from paying for your trip. And then you and I are allowed to travel. We have to declare that on our financial disclosure forms, that we received that gift travel. And all of those forms go into a database that the Clerk of the House keeps. That is how we recently discovered that about 200 members of Congress and staff were getting trips from a Turkish religious movement that were probably illegally paid for. It was looking through those forms, the privately funded travel, and discovering that they were funded by nonprofits that didn't exist, or they were funded by nonprofits that had no income. There was no way they could have paid for this stuff. They were funded by nonprofits that were run by the same nonprofit over here, the same guys, and they were co-declaring each other as ownership. That's where you find some very interesting trips, because the whole question then is, why is Group A or B willing to lay out $5,000 for you to fly to Cuba for 3 days? What's in it for them?
Mm-hmm. And where do you find these documents?
Those documents, both of them are in the Clerk of the House. You'll find them on the Clerk's website. In the Senate, you'll also find them in the Congressional Record. You will find the reports for foreign travel by the delegations, the official delegations. Those show up in the Congressional Record.
Let's talk about a story that you broke, Paul, the Congressman Gutierrez scandal.
Yeah, this is one that came out of the spending books. Same deal. Because I have now developed this hobby of just sort of reading through those things when they come out. And Gutierrez, Luis Gutierrez, a Democrat from Illinois, and I don't remember what I was looking for. I think I was looking for people who paid for training, because training is one of those categories where you can basically pay anybody. I could pay you $3,000 a month to come to my office and give us training in how to use a TV facility, under the argument that as a member of Congress, we need to know how to present our message to the voters. Taxpayers are paying for all this. Gutierrez was doing, I think, $6,000 a month to some media training, and it was called Schofield Consulting or something like that. And I was like, this looks weird. And over time I went back, it turned out it was his former chief of staff. The chief of staff quit, became a lobbyist in Chicago, working on local issues, but stayed on the congressman's payroll in this sort of consultant role, which is not permitted at all by the House rules. And there were times when Congressman Gutierrez was traveling to Chicago and meeting with people who were also clients of this lobbyist's work. So we believe that there are times when the lobbyist might have been writing the press release, both for the congressman and for the organization that was welcoming the congressman. And so we wrote the story, and it was almost immediately, the contract was canceled. And the Ethics Committee is supposedly investigating, but the way the congressional ethics process goes, we'll never hear again whether or not they actually looked into it.
Actually, let's talk about the ethics process.
Yeah. I describe it as, if you've ever spent any time around aircraft carriers, you'll know that there are these giant inflatable balloons that are aircraft carrier bumpers. They are not designed to prevent the aircraft carrier from banging into the dock. They're designed to prevent the aircraft carrier from doing any damage when it bumps into the dock. That is what the ethics committees in Congress are like. They are not designed to prevent people from running afoul of the ethics rules. They are designed to prevent any consequences from people running afoul of the ethics rules. And so the ethics rules are written to be these very squishy things. It's not entirely clear how they apply. It's almost impossible to prove anybody has done anything wrong. And the committees serve as an advisory to the member of Congress. So the member of Congress can call and say, can I take this trip to Turkey? And the committee will look at the thing and say, well, if you want us to approve this, which of course everybody wants to approve, we'll need the following paperwork. Paperwork arrives, committee looks at the paperwork, says, okay, looks fine to us, go ahead to Turkey. Now, if I find something wrong with that trip to Turkey a year and a half later, The member of Congress says, well, but I have this permission from the Ethics Committee. They said I could go. And the Ethics Committee says, well, the letter says that we reviewed all the documents, so it looked fine to us. If someone lied to us, that's not our fault. And everybody's safe.
Great oversight.
Magic.
Right.
Yeah, and that's why what I teach my students is the story in the newspaper suggesting that you've done something shady or improper is really the only penalty that is reliable. It's not, you can't be expected that the member of Congress is going to be punished by the House or expelled or even voted out of office. We'll see. The punishment is primarily the story that we write saying that you did something shady, which is why we have to be exceptionally careful about writing that story. We cannot simply say you did something shady unless we have facts that are damn solid to prove it. Because we are the judge and jury, and we are only credible if we choose to issue our sentence selectively. I can't write that you did something shady if I can't prove it, because otherwise we all look stupid. And I potentially damage your career with no right at all.
Well, Paul, those have been some terrific tips on how to cover Congress. You make it sound like such a wonderful playground for reporters.
So much fun, so much fun.
So thank you for joining us today from the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation, where we make good journalists better. Today we've heard from Paul Singer, Washington correspondent of USA Today. Thank you.